Hello again, everybody. So for this video, on a somewhat lighter note to the previous video, I want to talk about some of the aspects of 1920s America that see pretty big societal shifts, as well as looking at Prohibition, which brings about some of the more amusing aspects, and certainly some of the most well-known aspects of 1920s American life. Um, so, as I mentioned in the previous video, the 1920s is a period that sees massive societal transformation in the United States. The emergence of this urban, um, majority of a, the final kind of completion of that transition to a urban industrialized society. But it's also a period that brings about new shifts in personal behavior, in ideas about sexuality, and in terms of you know uh, this the visibility of African Americans in American society, amongst other things. One of the most one of the, in addition to being called the Roaring Twenties, of course, one of the other nicknames for the 1920s is the Jazz Age. And jazz, sexual liberation, and prohibition all kind of meet together in this time period, making rather strange bedfellows, if you will. But ultimately, um, you know, if you subtract any one element from one, it becomes difficult to imagine the other during this time period. So let's start with prohibition. Prohibition, as I previously mentioned, becomes law in the United States as a result of the ratification of the 18th Amendment, which was passed during World War I, primarily by appealing to intense anti-German, anti-immigrant sentiment. Um, but it's one of those things where people were really sold on something for a very short period of time, but once the thing that made them support something kind of goes away, they immediately begin having rather serious second thoughts about it. Prohibition stands as one of the great failures in policy in American history, and as a warning of the dangers of trying to legislate morality in American society. It's also a policy that, although it is generally seen as one of the things that defines the 1920s, is also wildly out of sync with the general political philosophy of the time period, which is generally in opposition to government regulation and government intervention, rather than this sort of over aggressive intervention of the state in personal and private affairs that prohibition represents. So that in of itself is kind of a big irony. Now, to look at this and why prohibition fails. It's important to understand what people expected of it when it was first passed. When prohibition was first passed, many in the United States thought that it was principally going to try to outlaw hard liquors, things that had very high alcohol content, things that could, cause people to, get blind drunk or, you know, be, severely addictive, what have you. Grain alcohols, basically. Um, but groups like the Anti-Saloon League went much further with what they thought was with what they sought to ban than many people at the time anticipated. The enforcement mechanism for prohibition, which is something known as the Volstead Act, is signed in 1919 and comes into full effect on January 1st, 1920, when prohibition takes effect. And basically, what the Volstead Act does is it bans most types of liquor, not just grain alcohols like whiskey or vodka or things like that, but also wines and beers and many other things that people thought would be given some sort of exclusion. Um, because it doesn't, this creates an enormous new opportunity on the black market, as does the massive loopholes within the enforcement of the act itself. One of the things that makes prohibition a kind of a joke almost from the outset is how many loopholes it in fact had. There were loopholes that allowed for the manufacture of sacramental wine, and other, liquors being used for religious observances. And wouldn't you know that the number of Americans who suddenly became religious, who suddenly found Jesus or what have you in the 1920s, to attend new ministries, um, increased quite substantially, as a result, during this decade. Um, Many churches actually built bars into their basement during this time period. If you go to some of the older Catholic parishes in St. Louis City, like Epiphany, they actually have bars from the 1920s that were built because they were exempt from the terms of the Volstead Act, amongst other things. Um, in addition to religious exceptions, there was also exceptions made for pharmacists and doctors. And so, wouldn't you know, the number of Americans who began receiving prescriptions for alcohol being used for the treating of headaches and various other maladies increased rather substantially following the passage of the Volstead Act. And, so there's all kinds of stuff like that. In addition, although making liquor for sale was explicitly banned in most instances, people could still buy grapes to make their own vineyards for personal consumption. They could still buy yeast and hops and other ingredients to make beer for personal consumption. In fact, one of the ways that Anheuser-Busch kept itself afloat in the 1920s was by selling industrial grade yeast that people could use to make their own home brews, their own microbrewing, if you will. And of course, many people, once they began doing this, they didn't just limit it to their friends and families, and they began selling it on the black market. Um, in addition, and this reflects the fact that demand never really abates. It remains constant throughout the time. And so, what this ends up really doing is it turns large numbers of otherwise law-abiding Americans into criminals by creating this vast underground market for this once legal, now prohibited substance, which, of course, in the process acquires a certain, um, you know, flair to it because of that illegality. And lots of people become engaged in the sale of liquor illicitly, oftentimes with very little effort to conceal their activities. The image of the 1920s in movies of speakeasies, these places where people have to do a specific knock on the door, and there's a guy with a peephole and a password and all that stuff. That was true in some places, but generally speaking, the police knew where the speakeasies were. In many cases, the local police were on the take from speakeasy owners, and generally speaking, they would only bust down illegal liquor operations when candidates were running for office or when somebody wanted to generate some sort of publicity. And usually the people who owned these things were tipped off well in advance so that they could make sure that they were scarce when these things happened. Um, so there's that. And then there's a massive, secondary market for illegal stuff being imported. One of the ways that the Kennedy family made its money was by the Kennedy patriarch, Joseph Kennedy Sr., um, building a fleet of speedboats operating out of Cape Cod that had surplus World War I aircraft engines that he put in boats specifically because they would be able to then outrun Coast Guard cutters as liquor was delivered, um, most of it from Ireland, through Cape Cod and what have you. Detroit became known as the wettest city in America because of its proximity to the Canadian border and boasted more speakeasies than any other American city. Um, and so, all this does is end up creating this culture of illegality. It turns many everyday citizens into criminals by engaging in this activity. It undermines faith in the police. In some cases, it actually corrupts local police departments. And the fact is that pretty much everybody is doing this openly. Even presidents like Warren G. Harding openly consume alcohol during this time period. He uses the caveat that, well, I had this stuff before it was illegal, so it's okay. But He's doing it. Other people are doing it, and so it becomes kind of normalized. Of course, what this ends up directly producing is organized crime syndicates, which grow exponentially as a direct result of prohibition, such as the outfit out of Chicago run by Al Capone, who, which turns many American cities like Chicago into, basically war zones between competing gangs. In Chicago, Capone's gang and its Irish rivals, the Northside Gang, um, are involved in around 200 homicides during this time period. Eventually, Capone is brought down in 1931, not because of his illegal alcohol trade, but because of tax violations, because he failed to pay his taxes. Um, so, in the end, um, as the nation enters the Great Depression, opposition to prohibition grows substantially, and eventually, the only time in American history this has ever happened, a new constitutional amendment is passed, the 21st Amendment, that explicitly repeals the 18th Amendment. That's literally all it does. It says nothing else. It just says that the 18th Amendment is appealed, prohibition's done. Bye bye. That takes effect in 1933. So it ends up being this massive failure. But it does end up having some pretty significant social ramifications. One of which is that it um, democratizes American drinking culture. Prior to Prohibition, um, bars and taverns were largely all male, all white affairs. But during Prohibition, because legal bars have been shut down, legal taverns have been shut down, women, um, many of whom enjoy a certain sense of liberation and freedom as a result of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, become a central part of the new American drinking culture. And so that is one of the leading things that kind of creates this new social norms in American society regarding relations between men and women. Um, Ideas about sexuality and, you know, marriage, what have, are relaxed considerably during the 1920s. Women wear much more revealing clothing than they had in prior decades. This, of course, is something which you see in movies with this whole image of the flapper girl, in these very kind of skimpy outfits and what have you. And of course, the soundtrack to all this is this new music form, jazz. Now, jazz is a product of the South, of the Deep South, of African American communities. During World War I, because of the wartime shortage in labor, large numbers of African Americans moved into the urban and industrial North in places like St. Louis and Chicago and Philadelphia, and in particular in New York, um, to find new jobs. This is something known as the Great Migration. Around 1 million or so African Americans relocated to the North between 1910 and 1920. As a result, during the 1920s, with large numbers of African Americans living in these new northern enclaves, um, African American culture for the first time really becomes central to the broader cultural matrix of the United States as a whole, particularly African American music, which is part of this broader cultural outpouring of Black culture known as the Harlem Renaissance. And it's not just limited to jazz musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and the like. It also includes poets like Langston Hughes, artists like Aaron Douglas, and various others. But music really becomes the principal means by which white Americans are exposed really for the first time to African American culture, and it becomes, kind of central to American culture. Now, the popularity of jazz does not necessarily translate into extending social or political freedoms for African Americans or bringing about any greater societal integration. In fact, oftentimes it's just the opposite. Um, Many white Americans enjoy Black music in the 1920s in a way that they had never enjoyed before, because of the availability of radio, because of the kind of wild culture of the speakeasies, what have you. But that doesn't translate into integration. Um, Case in point would be the Cotton Club in New York, in Harlem. The Cotton Club was one of the premier venues where African American musical acts performed in the 1920s, like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, Cab Calloway, and various others. Um, but what's interesting about it is that even though it was a club where the performers, where the um, where the wait staff, and where the cooks and bartenders and all that were African American, the clientele was not. The Cotton Club was a segregated club, so it's kind of this weird dynamic where you have white Americans going to oftentimes African American owned venues, but those venues themselves are segregated um, to separate whites from blacks in this time period. So it's kind of a weird thing. So again, the emerging centrality of African Americans into the mainstream of American culture does not necessarily translate into them being more broadly accepted or integrated into American society as a whole at this time period. In fact, in the period between 1915 and the 1920s, there are numerous race riots in the United States. One right across the river in East St. Louis, Illinois, in 1917 actually killed around 40 people. And then there's the famous Tulsa riot in 1921 that burns down the black portion of that city, what was known as Black Wall Street at the time. So, again, not necessarily something that translates into broader social consciousness, but all of these things, the criminality brought about as a result of Prohibition, the greater sense of sexual liberation and freedom that many women expressed in the 1920s, not all by any stretch, but which many women expressed in the 1920s through, a much greater sense of liberation in terms of how they dressed and acted, loosened restrictions about sexual propriety in general, and the emerging centrality of African Americans on popular culture. These likewise were things that factored into the kind of reactionary character of the political and social culture of the 1920s. So that's pretty much where I'm going to end that for today. When I come back on the next set of videos, we're going to look at the business or the governing culture of the 1920s and how that ultimately leads us to the Great Depression. So that'll be it for that.